In this video, we're going to learn how to build a Python AI agent that can help us make bookings or reservations. And it's going to be able to do this based on a table of available time slots. Specifically, we're going to be using Claude 3.5 Sonnet, and we're going to look at an API feature called tool use, or also known as function calling. This feature will enable your AI application to interact with the real world. For example, sending an email or getting information from a web page or a table. In the case of this project, we're going to use it to help us make a booking at a restaurant. Our app will have the tools that let us check which booking slots are available, and then make a booking under a name that we want. Because I want to keep this project simple, all of that booking information is just going to be stored as a CSV file on disk. Here is a simple example of what the CSV file will look like. So the rows are going to be time slots in 30-minute blocks, and then the columns are going to be which tables are available. By the time we're done with this project, we'll have an AI agent that we can chat with, just like a person, and we can ask it to help us make a booking. And if the time slot that we want isn't available, then it'll be able to recommend something else for us. And then if we do actually decide to make a booking, it'll also be able to actually modify the CSV file for us on disk as well. So now let me show you a demo of the finished product. In our terminal, we're going to run the app by just running this Python command. So to start, let's say that I want to book a table at 6:30 p.m. It's also going to need to know how many people I'd like to book for. So here it's asking me how many people will be in this group. So let's say 2. And now you can see here in the message, it's using this tool use feature to go and actually fetch the availability at this time. So if you actually go back to our CSV file that we're using as a data source, you see that the 6:30 block is completely booked. So what it's done instead is kind of read all the other cells in the table, and it's recommended other times that are available. And now it's asking us which alternative, if any, we'd like to choose. So here I might want to go with the 6 p.m. table for 2 people. And finally, to make the reservation, it also needs a reservation name. Because we haven't given that yet, it's going to ask us for this. So we'll put something in as well. Okay, and then after that, it's actually successfully made the booking for us, and the chat is finished. It's going to book 6 p.m. for 2 people on table 3. And now if we go back to open our CSV file in our project, we'll see that this 6 p.m. slot under table 3 is now booked with that new name that we've requested. So in summary, the project in a nutshell is going to be some kind of chat AI interface that can understand this data that we have, and it also has the power to ask for information to be able to make bookings or take action on the data itself. And it can also edit and modify that data. So that's going to be the goal of our project today. So in this video, I'm going to first go over the concept of using tools with AI agents, so you have a high-level understanding. Then we'll look at how to create tools in Python. I'll also show you how to create the schema for each tool as well. And this is going to be how we tell Claude about these tools. We'll then take a look at how to put everything together so that we have an AI agent that knows how to use all of these tools together. As always, I'll provide the GitHub code links in the project description as well. I actually recommend that you pause the video and download this now so that you can actually follow along while I explain the code. The concept of tool use is simple but very powerful, and it can help to unlock a lot of interesting use cases for your project. So let's get started. Before we jump into the code, let's quickly go over how tools work with LLM agents, or specifically Claude in this case. A tool is basically just a custom function that we can create. For example, if we wanted to look something up in our inventory, generate an invoice, or send an email, we can create a custom function to do that. And then we can tell Claude that, hey, this is a tool that's available for you to use. We need to tell Claude about the tools that exist, and we do that by passing in a JSON schema for each tool. A JSON schema is basically just some metadata that describes what the tool is called, what it does, when it should be used, and what type of inputs it can receive. And here's an example of what a JSON schema would look like. Then, when we interact with Claude, it can decide if and how it would like to use any of those tools available. So in this diagram, Claude has decided to use the inventory lookup tool, which just fetches some information from a database. We can then feed the result from that lookup back into our ongoing conversation with Claude. Here's another diagram that explains that flow in a little more detail. The user asks a question to the LLM model. The model decides that it needs to use a tool such as get user or get customer orders. Now the next part is important. The model itself doesn't have the ability to use tools or make external API calls. Instead, it just responds back to us that it would like to use a tool with these specific inputs. So it's actually up to our own application logic to execute those functions and then send the results back to the model. And this interaction can keep repeating in a loop until we have the final outcome that we want. Now, back to this project, we're going to build 3 tools. One of them is just going to be a simple input function to ask the user a question. So that's useful if we need more information from the user. Next, we'll have a function called getBookings. It will return a list of available booking slots closest to the time that we want. And lastly, we'll have a function to actually book the table. This will require the time slot and the name for that booking. These tools will have access to a data source. If you were building this in production, you'd probably be using a database for this. But this is a tutorial project, so our data is just going to be a CSV file in our project that we can read and write to. Finally, if we zoom out, here's what the overall lifecycle of our AI agent will look like. The user will start a conversation by sending the first message. Then the app will run in a loop between the LLM model, the tools, and the user. Every new piece of output will be appended to the message history, which is basically just a list of messages. This is then sent back to the LLM model to continue the engagement. Our ultimate objective here is to make a valid booking for the user and then have that saved into the CSV file. Now let's quickly go over the setup and the requirements for this project. I'm going to be building this project with Python, and the only dependency you'll need is the Anthropic SDK. Here's the version I'm using. You can pip install this directly, or you can also install it using the requirements file like I did in my project. You'll also need to have an API key from Anthropic. So if you don't have one yet, then head over to this website. There, you'll be able to create an account and get an API key. You might have to add some credits to your plan first, but when I was making this video, you normally get some free credits when you first start out. Once you have the API key, you need to set it into your environment variable for the Anthropic SDK to work properly. Next, we'll need to add sample data to test our booking system. You can either create a new CSV file with just some random time slots and booking information, or you can clone or download my GitHub project and then just get the sample CSV file from there. And for our project structure, I'm going to put this booking CSV file under a data subdirectory of the root directory of the project. So it's going to look something like this. And here I'm in my actual project in VS Code. So you could see here I have a data folder, and inside I have the booking CSV file. And this is the raw CSV file, is what it looks like. I also created a bookings originals CSV file because as you saw earlier, this bot will modify this active CSV file. So if we actually ever want to revert it, we can just restore it back to this originals one, which is sort of like read only. It's not being used by the code. Now, another thing to note is that if you're working with this in VS Code, the CSV plain text format is pretty hard to read. Like looking at this, I can't really see it looking like a table. So if you want an easier way to read this information, you can install some extensions that might let you open this as a preview. So for example, if I right click and open it as a preview, I could see this more nicer looking interface here. Of course, if you have Excel or Microsoft Office, you could also just open this file directly with Excel to see it in a nicer table format. So again, to summarize, the CSV file will show a booking schedule for the restaurant tables. Each row is a time slot and each column is a table. And the first column shows the time, while the other columns show either an empty cell if it's still available or a name if it's already booked. Our app will then use this data to check for availability, and then it will also make reservations and manage bookings directly into the CSV file. So it needs to be able to access and modify this file directly. And when we use our app, you actually see the file get updated. Next, let's go ahead and create our tools. Remember, these are just custom Python functions that we want the LLM model to be able to use. In total, we're going to have 3 tools: a tool to ask the user for input, a tool to get booking information, and a tool to actually make the booking. So here are going to be the function signatures of each of these functions. Just take a moment to look at these and see if they make sense to you. This is important because this is closest to what the LLM will see. It doesn't actually get to see the implementation of each function. So any judgment it has to make, such as which tool to use or what to use for its parameters, is based on what's communicated by the function signature. We actually do get to add a bit more metadata, but we'll cover that later in the tool schema. Now, before on this channel, I've had some feedback that maybe I'm going through the content a bit too fast or not typing it out, but I just want to explain that this is usually my style of doing these tutorials is I build out the whole project and have the code available on GitHub for you to follow through because I think just typing it out just takes a lot of time and, it's a little bit too slow. Most of the time, you probably gain most of the understanding by watching the explanation. If you actually need to take some more time, then pause the video, go through the code, but make sure you just open this project up so that you can see how all the code fits together. The next part we're going to talk about is actually each of these individual tools and how they're implemented. So as I mentioned before, we are creating 3 tools, a tool to ask the user for a prompt, a tool to book a table, and a tool to get the booking slots. And in the project, this is under the tools folder. There are going to be 3 separate Python scripts, one for each of the tools. Now let's zoom in and just talk about what we want out of each tool very quickly. The first one is really simple. It just displays a prompt to the user and then returns their input as a string. If you're building a chatbot, you don't necessarily even need to make this a tool. You could just make the input loop an explicit part of your program. I think that's probably better in most cases, but because this is a tool use tutorial, let's just stick with this for now. Now for the bookings function, I want it to return a list of available bookings for a given time and table or a party size. If nothing is available at that exact time, I should get back a list of the closest available slots. I mean, intuitively as a customer, that's just probably how I'd expect a good booking system to work. So here I'm kind of showing you the function signature. I've kind of taken out the code and just replaced it with comments. I think it's more important to explain what we're actually trying to do with it. And then I'll show you the code quickly on my GitHub. So when I use this function, it'll start by opening up the CSV file, and then it'll look through the data for slots that are close or within that time range. And then it'll sort and return them as a string. And then if you actually look at our code for get bookings slot in the project, you'll see that it does exactly that. So I still have all the comments here kind of stepping through the logic piece by piece, except that you could see the implementation of how it's done. There's a little bit of parsing, reading the CSV file, and then just looping through to find the best slots. I don't think it's really important to understand how all this works. I mean, this is just, regular Python coding. So if you're confused about this or you really want to dig into this, then sure, pause the video for a bit and then work through this part of the code. But I think the really important part to get out of this section in the video is to understand what the function signature communicates to Claude and what the inputs and the name and the return type of the function are going to be. Finally, here's our last tool, the book table function. This one is also pretty self-explanatory. It will attempt to book a specific table and time for a given reservation name. It updates the CSV file if the booking is successful and returns either a success or an error message. And then again here, this is the code implementation of that function. So there's nothing super complex about this. This is just regular Python, opening a CSV file, checking if it can make that booking. And if it can, it will go ahead and update that file with the new entry. And then depending on which outcome we get, we will return a message, successful if it's able to make that booking, or failure if it's already booked, or if a table and a time that we requested was not even in the table to begin with. Now that we have the functions, our next task is to define the schemas for each of these functions. So this is basically a JSON object that describes the tool in a way that the LLM can understand. And here's an example of a schema. This is for a tool called getWeather. We have the name of the tool, the description, and an input schema. So this is the structure that we need to use with Claude if we want to use function calling or tool use. If you recall what I said at the start of the video, an LLM model can't use these tools directly, but it can communicate the intent to use a tool. And to do that, it needs to have enough information about each tool to make that decision. In our project, I'm going to save the schema for each tool as a separate JSON file. And I'm going to put them inside a schema folder under the tools folder of the project. So here, if I go back to my VS Code, you'll see that there's the tools folder here, and then inside I have a schema folder. And then for each of the tools I have, I'm going to have a separate JSON file that describes that tool. Now, if you want to try to create these schemas for yourself, it's an exercise I strongly recommend. You can pause the video now and give it a shot. Otherwise, here's what my schema looks like for the Ask User tool. Now, if you compare this with the original function signature, you could see it pretty much attempts to make a one-to-one mapping. So the name of the function is also the same as the name of the tool. And the input parameter is also named the same way. So it's input prompt. Now, I did have to add an extra description field to the tool though. This description will help Claude to understand what the tool does so that it can make better decisions about when to use it. Now, to actually come up with this schema, you can either just write this in JSON yourself manually in your editor, but that is a little bit time consuming. But what I actually did here was I just prompted an AI chat, so Claude or ChatGPT, to create one for me. And I did that by giving it the function implementation and an example schema. However, if you're an experienced developer, you're probably wondering at this point, why don't we just have a class or a data structure that automatically prepares the schema for us? I mean, as you saw, most of it is just a one-to-one map of the function signature. You might have to add the description as metadata, but that's fine. So that's actually even less work, and then we don't have to maintain two separate sources of truth. Because right now, if I have the schema and I have the function separated, I'd have to edit both if I want to change anything about them. The idea of kind of creating some tooling that makes it combined is absolutely the right instinct. And I think that Anthropic is also actually working on a tools library to help us do exactly that. So you can check this out if you're interested. But because this is still an alpha, I didn't use this in the video because I think that it's probably going to change quite a lot. So by the time you're looking at this, it already might be different from when I'm recording it. However, I'd probably say that the idea of this is very, very good. So if you look at this page and it is out of alpha, then I recommend to probably use this instead. Now we're almost ready to integrate the tools with our app. But first, let me show you a couple of helper functions I created. You don't need to use these, but I think that they make the actual AI integration a little bit easier to understand. First, I have a function to load this JSON schema for each tool because we've saved the JSON schema to disk, but in Python, we actually need it as a Python object. So this basically just loads it from disk. Now, when Claude decides that it wants to use a tool, it will respond with a message structured as a tool use block. Here's an example of what that looks like. As you can see, it has the name of the tool and the input parameters as a dictionary. So to make it easier to use this tool use block response structure, I have another helper function called useTool. This will map the AI output to the correct tool and then execute it with those input parameters. So you can read it, and that's basically just what it does. It's pretty simple. And you'll find that the code for those helper functions that I described is in this tools.py file inside the project. So that's going to be in the tools folder under tools.py. And then you have all of that code there for us to use. Now we finally have all the pieces that we need to integrate our tools with Claude so that we can build an AI agent that will help us make these restaurant bookings. Let's go back to our original plan here again. The idea is that we start the interaction with a user sending a message. And we're going to keep a historical list of messages as well, because we want this to be an ongoing conversation. Every time we send a message to Claude, we basically have to send the entire message history because each interaction with the LLM is actually stateless. So whenever you have those really long chat windows or conversations, it's actually resending everything from the beginning of the chat each time, which is why if you use one chat window for a very long time, it starts to give you a warning that long conversations are not as high performing and a little bit more expensive. However, if we do want that continuous conversation, we do need to keep a history of all those messages. So we'll do that, we'll start the loop, and then we'll send our messages to the LLM, and then it'll respond with either a message directly or the intent to use a tool. If it decides to use a tool, we'll already have our helper functions ready to map and execute them. This will read or write to our external data source, which is this CSV file. Finally, the response from the tool will be fed back to the LLM, so we pretty much continue this loop until the conversation is finished. First, here's the main function I'm going to use. This lets us send a message block to Claude. I've specified all of the LLM parameters here. I've also specified system message, a list of the schemas of all the tools available, and a list of our messages from our conversation history. Now I'm going to do more stuff in the second half of this function, but we'll come back to that later. And you can see most of this is literally just the example code of how to call Claude via its SDK. So I just copied this from the documentation and I've just plugged it in with the stuff that we want to send. So that's basically all this is, even though it looks pretty long. Now, because that function is quite long, I'm going to wrap it into another simpler send message function. And this one will basically just let us send one text string or one message using that previous larger function that we set up earlier. So this is what I'm actually going to use to start the conversation or send any kind of new user input to Claude. And here's another wrapper function called sendToolResult. The tool result is the return output of one of our custom functions. So this is mostly the same thing here as the previous one, except that this is wrapping it around a block for the tool response. We will communicate the output of the tool as a string, and we'll also need the tool ID. So there's a tool use ID field here. We don't have that yet. That will be provided to us when the LLM tells us that it wants to use a tool. So it will give us an ID. We just need to remember that ID and send it back with this result. Next, we'll need another helper function that checks whether or not we want to use a tool and then uses it if we do. So this function will take in a list of messages as its input, which will include the latest response from Claude. And then this would check if we need to use a tool, and if we do, it'll actually execute it as well. We can do that by checking if the stop reason of the response is equal to tool use. So that's a hard-coded string, and if it is equal to that, then we will find that message block and pass that entire block to our helper function to use that tool. And then if we just go back a little bit, we'll see that the tool use block sent to us from Claude is going to look something like this. So if Claude tells us it wants to use a tool, it'll give us this information, which has the ID of the tool. It'll also give us the name of the tool, which we will use in our map and then actually find the reference to our function to use. It'll also have the input parameters as well. And after we use that function to execute the tool successfully, we will have a result. So we can use our sendToolResult helper function just before to send the result back to Claude, and then the conversation will continue. Now let's go back to our sendMessageBlock function, which was the very first function we looked at in this chapter. If you remembered, I kind of had a history to like we're gonna do more stuff at the second half of this function. So let's take a look at what that is now. This is going to be the second half of that function. I've kind of commented out the first half. After we get the response back from Claude, we'll append this response to the message history. And then we'll just pass that entire history into the check and use tool function that we just created. So if it turns out that a tool is needed, the tool will then be executed as part of the function, and it'll also send the result back to Claude. So this actually goes through sendMessageBlock again. And this is recursive. So we'll have that ongoing conversation loop that we wanted. And it will continue as long as we need to until Claude decides that, we don't need to use any more tools and the conversation is over. In this case, it works because our re-engagement of the user, for example, if the user says they need a table, but they didn't say what time, we actually have that tool to ask the user for more information. So as long as there's not enough information, hopefully this bot will work in the loop. Finally, at the start of the app, we can kick off the conversation by asking the user to provide the first input when we start the program. So here's the script to do that. We just spent quite a lot of time going through all the logical parts of the code. So let's actually take a look at our real project and see how it's all wired up. I've got my data here in my CSV file. So that's just sitting here in this data folder. And then in the tools folder, I have each of my tools implemented as a function. So there's asking user for an input. This just creates an input prompt. Getting the booking slots available. So this is just reading a CSV file, and then booking a table. So reading and writing to a CSV file. And each of these tools returns a string, which is going to be used as the tool result to Claude eventually. And then I have the schema for each tool as well as a separate JSON file for each of these. So I have the description here describing what the tool does, and then a bunch of other metadata about the input and what's required from the input. So that's going to be in the tools schema folder. And finally, I have a bunch of tool helper functions as well. So this is just the ones that we talked about earlier for loading the schema and putting them into a variable so we can reference them. And then a helper function to use the tool based on Claude's response. So this will map it back to one of these functions, and then it will execute it and return the result. So those are all our tools. Now, in the actual main booking bot script, it has all those wrappers to send the message to Claude via the SDK. I'll create the client here, and I've put my API key in the environment variable. So this will just be hooked up to my API account. And here is my send message block function. So here is just a generic API call to send a message to Claude. And you could see here is the system prompt. So you can have a read of this if you want to write your own, but this is telling it to use the tools and make the booking and how to go about doing that. And here's all my other parameters. And then here are all the tool schemas. So when you're actually sending the client this message, the tools parameter that you're sending are actually just going to be the JSON schema of the tools. So they're going to be Python dictionaries. It won't be actually the tool functions themselves. And then here is going to be the message history of the entire conversation. Okay, so that's our client sending the message. And if you want to see the response or you want to debug it, then you can print it out. Here, we're just adding whatever response to the history, because remember, we want to keep a full history of the conversation. And then finally, we have this check and use tool function. And yeah, we went through this already. If it needs to use a tool, it's just actually going to use that tool, and it can actually be recursive if it needs to keep talking to the user. So here's when it decides to use a tool and when it sends the result back. And then these two functions, sending message and sending tool result, are just wrappers to kind of transform the information. It doesn't really do anything much. It just kind of wraps those interfaces and makes it a little bit nicer. So then when you put everything together, you just have to start this by using this ask user function, which we already created here as an input. And then we'll have that first message as our history, and then we'll send that message. The bot would just keep going until it successfully made that booking for us. So this script is in the root folder of the project called bookingbot.py. And if we want to use it, we just go into the project folder and then just run python bookingbot.py. So let's have another demo of the finished product. The first message is tell us about the time and seats you'd like to book. So I can start by saying 5 p.m. for 3 people. Okay, and you can see here, this is actually something really interesting I want to show you. It's done this first part successfully, this bot. So it's responded to this message, it's understood our request, and it's used this tool to actually look up which booking slots are available. And this is the response that it's gotten from our own helper function. What Claude does next is actually it recommends us what tables are available. So it lets us choose. However, it's kind of just ended the conversation. I mean, at this point, our program design was that it needs to realize that it needs to ask for input. So we'll use that tool again. So the conversation keeps going. But because it didn't decide to use that tool, it's just kind of left a generic message and says, hey, if you need more information, feel free to ask. But we can't actually ask anything because, the program has terminated. So that's a weakness of the way I've designed the loop. I should have made it so that the input and the termination conditions are more enforced rather than just based on this Claude deciding whether or not it needs to use a tool. So that's just an interesting outcome that can happen from doing it this way. But I'm going to do it again and maybe just use a different prompt or something like that so that I can show you the loop when it works as intended. Okay, here I'm asking for a table for 5 p.m. and then it knows that, it doesn't actually have enough information. So it's asking us how many people will be in our party. So we'll just say 2. And now it's done the same thing. It's gone and looked up our availability for 5 p.m. for 2 people. But this time it's actually realized that it actually needs to ask us for our name as well to make that booking. Here, let's go for table 4. And it also asks us to give a name. So let's put a name as well. So the name I put here is just test user, and I've wanted table 4. And now it's also realized that we need to make that reservation in the CSV file. So it's gone ahead and done that. And that was successful. And here's a summary of that booking. So here, this app worked as intended. It didn't kind of terminate early and as actually kind of asked us for the information we need until it's completed. So let's go back to our project because now I'm expecting the CSV file to be changed. So if I open the preview and I look at our table at 5 p.m. at table 4, you can see that our test user is actually created in the CSV file. And I'll just make that a bit bigger for you to see. So it's right here. Now, this project was actually really fun for me to work on, and I hope you enjoyed it too. If you get stuck or need help at any point, feel free to leave a comment either in this video or on the project on GitHub. Again, here is the GitHub link for this project. I'll try to keep it up to date. If you have any other ideas for projects or tutorials you'd like to see from this channel, then let me know in the comments because I'd love to make them for you. Anyways, I hope you found this useful. I'll see you in the next one.